Let me just say good morning to those in the United States, especially Tabitha, who is up very early, and good evening to those in China. Especially appreciate President Wu and Zhu Feng joining us so late in the evening, and it will be even later by the time we conclude. This program is the first one that we're doing on this important issue of U.S.-China maritime conflict and dispute management in the South China Sea. All of you see in the newspapers these days, the waters of the South China Sea have become a flashpoint for the intensifying U.S.-China rivalry, raising concerns about the potential for a military clash. We've got 5 outstanding panelists with us today, all of whom are good friends of mine, and all of whom participate in a Track 2 dialogue, which we've been running for many years with the South China Seas Institute, which even in this difficult environment shows that experts in the area can find a way, even in this difficult political environment, to talk rationally about constructive ways we can try and resolve these issues in the South China Sea. I don't want to spend time going over the bios of everybody because we've got a ton to talk about. So let me just give 1-sentence introductions of where they are and then kick off the discussion. Wu Shichen, as I think everybody on this call knows, is president of the China's National Institute for South China Seas Studies. Taylor Fravel is the Arthur and Ruth Sloan Professor of Political Science and Director of the Security Studies Program at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Tabitha, thank you, Tabitha, for getting up so early. Tabitha Grace Mallory is founder and CEO of the China Ocean Institute and affiliate professor at the University of Washington's Henry Jackson School of International Studies. Zhu Feng is the executive director of the China Center for Collaborative Studies of the South China Sea and director of the Institute of International Relations at Nanjing University. And Peter Dutton is a professor at the Strategic and Operational Research Department at the U.S. Naval War College. So let's kick it off with President Wu. Each of the speakers will speak for 5 minutes, more or less. I think because we only have 2 Chinese, we have 3 Americans. We'll give President Wu and Zhu Feng an extra minute or 2 to go on, so that it will be equal between the 2 sides. But looking forward to your comments. We've already gotten some wonderful questions for our audience. Not only is the panel very distinguished, but the attendees is also a very sophisticated group of listeners and watchers. So President Wu, it's wonderful to see you again. I'm sorry I can't visit you in Sanya or in Haikou. I miss the good weather, the company, and the good food. But let me turn it over to you first.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this wonderful dialogue with my American colleagues on the South China Sea issue. Well, in my presentation, I'm going to look at 2 issues. The first is about the current South China Sea situation. The second is about on how to manage the conflicts between China and the United States in the South China Sea. About the current South China Sea situation, I would say, compared with the past, there are some new volatile and worrisome developments in the South China Sea this year. First, economies in this region have been hit by COVID-19 to different degrees. Governments have shifted their attention from maritime cooperation and negotiations on the COC in the South China Sea to economic recovery and job creation. Second, the comprehensive deterioration of China-US relations has made those 2 countries more confrontational. on the South China Sea issue, which can be seen in their totally opposite rhetorics and actions in the political, diplomatic, and the military fields. If we look at the FNOPs conducted by the United States so far this year, it was 8 times, and also the statement of the U.S. South China Sea policy made by State Secretary Michael Pompeo. I think it could be viewed as a turning point of the U.S. South China Sea policy. It means that the neutrality of the South China Sea policy is no longer of the U.S. policy. The third, claimant states have taken unilateral actions one after another, such as aggressive demonstration of sovereign oil and gas development in disputed areas, and diplomatic statements to reinforce unilateral actions. For instance, the diplomatic statements made by multiple countries so far, altogether 24 diplomatic notes delivered to the United Nations by countries, including China and the 5 member states of ASEAN, United States, Australia, Britain, France, and Germany. Also, the driving forces behind those unilateral actions, from my perspective, are as follows. China's growing capability of upholding its rights in the South China Sea is the primary triggering factor, leading to the increasing sense of insecurity among other claimant states, the narrow window for the COC negotiations, the U.S. abandoning of its neutral policy towards the South China Sea, and the negative impact of South China Sea arbitration ruling. Fourth, the crisis management mechanism between China and the United States may fail. And the expanding gray zone may increase the risks of China-US conflicts in the South China Sea. The gray zone, there are Coast Guard's law enforcement activities, Maritime Malaysia, even IUU fishing activities. Fifth, it has become uncertain whether the COC negotiations will be concluded on time, because it is supposed to have 4 working groups meetings and 2 senior official meetings this year, because the COVID-19, so far nothing happened. So it is uncertain where the COC will be concluded. The second reading of the COC text by end of this year. Outside the extra-regional countries keep intervening in the South China Sea affairs without restraint by the COC in the future. So the role of the COC in maintaining stability and managing crisis in the South China Sea will be questionable. So when it comes to the factors and the trends affecting the South China Sea in the future, the US presidential election will have an impact on US policy on the South China Sea. If Joe Biden is elected, the US policy will be different. At least the military operations, such as freedom navigation, will not be completed, decided by the military without restraint by the US administration. For some current states, the Malaysia government has a wavering position. Vietnam is going to have a new leadership after the 13th National Congress of the Communist Party of Vietnam at the first quarter of next year. And the Philippines will have a new president after election in 2022. So new leaders in these countries are expected to make an issue of the South China Sea in order to consolidate their basis for leadership. It is expected that the COC negotiation will not be smooth sailing. The US fact, the interference of arbitration decision, the less willingness and the sense of urgency among other claimant states to reach consensus with China may delay the COC negotiation process. The United States, Japan, India, and Australia are strengthening their port cooperation and expanding their security cooperation in the South China Sea. So this will militarize greater power competition in the South China Sea and make it more urgent to build a multilateral crisis management mechanism. Closer cooperation between the United States and Taiwan and Taiwan's southbound policy may make Taiwan a liability for China's mainland in upholding its rights in the South China Sea. As the United States has, I just mentioned, adjusted its policy towards the South China Sea, and the President Dutton of the Philippines is approaching the end of his term, the arbitration ruling will be revived again and become a factor to undermine the stability in the South China Sea. So, in short, in my opinion, the South China Sea will undergo a new round of volatility in the next 3 to 5 years, a period which is more unpredictable, precarious, destructive, and military oriented. Second, my personal suggestions on managing conflicts between China and the United States in the South China Sea. Given the all-round confrontation between China and the United States, official dialogues, including meal-to-meal, have come to a halt. Lack of mutual trust has weakened the binding force of existing crisis management mechanisms. Let me give you an example. The accident, was happening in September 13th, 2018, between the two destroyers of United States and China. It means that in some special time, special occasion, the existing crisis management between China and the United States may not be workable. And also the gray zone is expanding with no consensus, no mechanism, and no restriction. The risks for conflicts and frictions caused by misunderstanding and misjudgment are higher than any time before. So in this context, I would like to put forward the following suggestions. First, the United States should abide by its commitment to keep it neutral on the South China Sea question, rather than just hold no position on territorial sovereignty of islands and reefs. Given the background and the causes of the South China Sea issue, claims to islands and reefs shall not be separated from those to maritime waters. Support for one country's claims to maritime waters, in fact, means support for its claim to islands and reefs. Therefore, it is not viable for the United States to hold no position on sovereignty of islands and reefs. Support for one country's maritime claim, in fact, is actually taking side. Second, my second suggestion, the United States should cut its military operations in South China Sea in order to reduce risks of military conflicts with China there. For example, the United States should exercise its restraint.
President, you need to wrap it up. Yep.
Restraint on freedom navigation, closing reconnaissance, military exercise, and building military bases around the South China Sea. In response, what China should do, China shouldn't deploy offensive weapons in its islands and reefs and not announce the establishment of ADIZ over the South China Sea. Third, the two countries should establish a meal-to-meal dialogue at the commander level and covering military operations in the South China Sea, and discuss the establishment of full coverage of its crisis management mechanism in the South China Sea, particularly on the application of the Code of Unplanned Encounters at Sea applied to the Coast Guard and the Coast Force. The United States should think twice before it introduces a quad security cooperation into the South China Sea. Fifth, the United States shouldn't make use of Taiwan in the South China Sea question to undercut China's rights and interests in South China Sea, because this will increase tensions across the Taiwan Straits and make the situation in the South China Sea more complex due to the confrontation across the Taiwan Straits. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you for attention.
Okay.
So quickly.
There's a lot. If some of the U.S., I mean, I can start responding to some of this, but I will go on to the next, Taylor, who's next. But I think if the U.S. Speakers can start to respond to some of the aspects, I'll be happy to do it when everybody's finished speaking. But there's some things in there which are rather, in my view, controversial. Taylor.
Great. Thanks to the National Committee for having me, and thanks to our colleagues from China who are joining us in the evening their time. So in my 5 minutes, I wanted to make just a few points. I think some of them, which we'll be reflecting on sort of the current situation in the South China Sea, may overlap with a little bit of what was just said. But I'll try to put an American spin on it, or an American perspective. So my first point, right, is that we need to take a step back and just reflect on the context in which we are now thinking about the South China Sea and its future, right? Which is the really significant decline in U.S.-China relations over the past few years, but which has really accelerated in 2020. So according to Pew Research, right, the percentage of Americans who view China negatively has increased from 47% to 78% in the last 5 years, right? So this is a pretty grim situation in some respects when trying to think about managing a complex issue by the South China Sea. Now, the good news perhaps is that the South China Sea has not necessarily been the most prominent issue in certainly American perceptions of U.S.-China relations. These include trade, technology, Xinjiang, Taiwan, Hong Kong, et cetera, et cetera. But I think there's bad news here, which does have implications for how the South China Sea can be managed. I think there's going to be sort of perceptions of higher domestic costs to be paid for cooperative actions, or even confidence building measures or stability management measures. And there's also sort of within the United States, perhaps, given the overall sort of low state of the relationship with China, but also I think there'll be perhaps perceived reputational cost for doing so as well. And so I think the imperative here, given the way in which the overall relationship is declining, is to focus on what at a base, sort of a bare minimum level, would be kind of the shared interests or the common interests of the US and China and the other claimants in the South China Sea, upon which some basis of stability can be maintained for the coming period, which, as Dr. Wu mentioned, is volatile. So my second point is that I think from a US perspective, right, the disputes in the South China Sea have sort of transformed or been transformed from a more narrow sort of contest over sovereignty and jurisdictional claims to a much wider issue involving status and hegemony in Southeast Asia. And this goes back to some of the actions that certainly attract a lot of American attention, most notably the island building in 2014 and 15 and the power projection facilities that China was able to build out as a result. And then more recently, actions that are challenging the hydrocarbon activities of littoral states within their coastal EEZs, not within EEZs that they might claim from any of the disputed islands, but actually EEZs that they claim from their coast. And in these areas, of course, it sort of overlaps with China's 9-dash line, which raises real questions about the legal basis for China's actions here, which appear to be historic rights, but have not necessarily been fully articulated by China. And so in the last few years, we've seen Chinese harassment of drilling operations and Chinese surveys within the EEZs of Vietnam and Malaysia. For this reason, of course, ASEAN took a particularly strong stand this summer in some of its joint statements, underscoring the importance of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea as a way of kind of challenging this idea of historic rights. And then more generally, from a US perspective, of course, some of the language that China included into the first negotiating text for the COC, I think, raised some alarm bells. Specifically, right, China included language that was designed to include the signatories, or ASEAN and China, from conducting military exercises with, quote, countries from outside the region. This sort of appeared to be sort of deliberately designed to exclude the United States, thus kind of transforming the more narrow disputes into something, to sort of a broader set of questions about Southeast Asia more generally. Thirdly, turning to US policy, as Dr. Wu mentioned, right, continuation of the Freedom of Navigation Program, 8 so far this year, after 8 were conducted in 2019. And this has sort of been a hallmark of, I think, the Trump administration's approach, although I think year on year, they appear to be increasing a little bit in frequency. And then, as was mentioned, right, the emphasis and elaboration of US support for the tribunal in its 2016 ruling, and the July statement made by Mike Pompeo. This didn't substantially alter the US sort of position on the ruling, which was articulated back in 2016 by the State Department, but it was much more public and much more vivid, and of course was framed around the language of deteriorating US-China relations. I do want to interject here quite briefly, just to flag it for later. I don't believe this statement on maritime claims represents a change in US sort of position, or the US position regarding neutrality in the South China Sea, which focuses on claims to land features. And I don't think neutrality links land features and maritime claims, largely because the maritime claims by the other states, especially Vietnam and Malaysia, are not based upon disputed islands, but in fact based upon their coastlines, right? Other elements of US policy that are new, sanctions announced in August on state-owned enterprise-linked entities that were involved in land reclamation about 5 years ago. And in this sense, these two US policies in some ways are retrospective. I think that they could be interpreted as a reaction both to land reclamation and to the tribunal, not necessarily current events. But what is new in particular, I think, is the fact that US naval vessels have been showing up more frequently within the EEZs of Vietnam and Malaysia, particularly when hydrocarbon exploration activity is occurring. And so in May, you had a US littoral combat ship near the West Capella, which was a rig in Malaysia's EEZ. And then earlier this fall, back in July, the United States also was present in Vietnam's EEZ when China was conducting a survey there. So I think that takes me over 5 minutes. I had one more point, but I'll save that for the Q&A. Back to you, Steve.
Great. Yeah, and that deals with some of President Wu's issues that he's raised. Tabitha.
Yeah, so likewise, thank you for having me. Thanks to the National Committee and to my fellow panelists. I'm going to talk about the marine living resources because these are both a basis for conflict in the South China Sea and are also an issue that many hope has the potential to bring people together. And so in preparing these remarks, kind of like Taylor, I was thinking about, you know, what's a bare minimum area of cooperation, and also trying to think of something optimistic to say about these issues. And so, you know, can we identify some areas in which the US and China have common interest? And I noted that both countries share in common a criticism of each other's environmental policies. So yesterday, the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs issued a fact sheet detailing environmental damage caused by the United States, which is in response to a similar fact sheet that was issued by the US State Department about a month ago on China's environmental abuses. And I would say that both sides are largely correct in their assessments. And so this brings me to the question of, you know, what should a country do when its leadership is being, you know, maybe just merely rhetorical, or even on the opposite end of the spectrum, hypocritical on some of these important issues. And so one thing I was thinking of is that this is not the only solution, but I think one important contribution is to turn to thinking about positive things that we can do outside the government while we are awaiting leadership that is more conducive to making progress. Because I don't know that at the government level, there is much potential for that at the moment. But I do think that we can make plans for when the moment is right. And in the area of marine environment and fisheries management, I am more optimistic. For example, I was on a call last week with a Chinese fishery scientist who pointed out that China lacks robust communication channels between its scientific research community on the one hand and the policy community on the other hand in China. And so that's a really important issue when you're thinking about best practices for managing, these environmental resources. And it's an area in which the academic and think tank communities can be of some use. This is also an area where the US could make some progress. We don't do this perfectly either. So it's an area where we can have more discussion and dialogue. And then even in areas where the government is taking the lead. For example, both the US and China have recognized the need to better address illegal, unreported, and unregulated, or IUU fishing. And so can we think about making some progress on how to handle cases of IUU fishing, perhaps progress on developing the technology that we need for monitoring and surveillance of coastal waters, more progress on identifying points of contact and protocols for handling this, and to kind of get back to Dr. Wu's point about thinking about the mechanisms that we have in place to manage conflicts. And I think this is thinking about fisheries management is one of them, but more broadly, the mill-to-mill dialogue, cues. I think it's important to think about, how are these existing mechanisms possibly failing us? In which ways could they be improved? And I think we can have that same kind of thinking for managing the living resources too. And so that brings me to the next question, which is, well, what is the next smallest thing that can be done on managing marine living resources? And I'll say at the outset that this is complicated because there's no one solution for all species and all areas of the South China Sea. And you need separate solutions for species like tuna and squid versus species that are harvested through bottom trawling. There is an existing regional fisheries management organization, or an RFMO, for tuna. This is the Western and Central Pacific Fisheries Commission. So that legally covers the South China Sea, but doesn't do so in practice. And then a species like squid is not regulated at all at the international level. But if you're thinking about a management solution for fisheries as a way to switch the paradigm on thinking about sovereignty issues, as this has been brought up before. So these are ideas, these post-sovereignty or meta-sovereignty ideas like a peace park or some kind of international marine protected area. You need not just an RFMO, but an area-based management solution, because an RFMO just manages the resources, while an area-based management solution is tied to a geographical area. So it's kind of one way you could sidestep a sovereignty issue over a given feature. But of course, a solution like this will not solve the maritime boundary disputes between the 9-dash line that China claims and the EEZs of the other claimant states. Taylor was talking about some of the harassment that's been going on the part of the Chinese for the hydrocarbon facilities in the EEZs of the other claimant states. And this also goes on with the fisheries, of course. Trawlers that are in Indonesian EEZ will have Coast Guard accompaniment in other countries as well. And so those still remain to be resolved. But if countries were to implement some kind of multilateral arrangement on a limited scale in a limited area in the South China Sea as an experiment, this might possibly illuminate some next steps, ways to handle other issues. There's also a difference between industrial fishing and the artisanal or subsistence level fishing that goes on in the coastal areas. The industrial fleet receives huge subsidies. That's an issue that needs to be resolved. And so next year, the Chinese are hosting the meeting on the Convention on Biological Diversity. And I could see that as an occasion to develop an idea like this and to make some progress. And meanwhile, we as the United States can hope that the US will ratify the CBD in the first place, along with some other notable international conventions dealing with maritime issues. I'm done. Thanks.
Great, Tabitha. Thanks. And thanks for staying within your time. We've got some great questions we want to discuss. Zhu Feng.
Thank you, Steve. So thanks all of you invite me and join such a great panel. I would like to share a couple of my observations, particularly in this year. I think the South China Sea issue has never been more stormy and even provocative to our bilateral relations. The reason is very simple. First is, I think the South China Sea conflict actually has a very, very badly overtaken the Taiwan Strait issue. When we look at the China-US dispute of the Taiwan issue, then at least we have had some sort of, we say, one China policy consensus. Yes, the Trump administration really blurred the line in the Chinese eye on how to just abide by the one China principle or one China policy. But the problem is the Taiwan Strait is too much close to the Chinese coast, then there will see such a frequency and even just potential, we say, risk of accidental encountering in air and at sea in Taiwan Strait has just proved to be much lower than the South China Sea. But what's the South China Sea? For the American Navy, the South China Sea mostly is international water. It's very, very significant, so we say, maritime corridor. So then what we'll see, yes, probably superficially, the Taiwan issue probably is more embarrassing, but actually for the two navals posture in the West Pacific, then we will have to say the South China Sea also proved to be the more significant and the more, the eye-catching for the both people and the region as well. Then another factor is also very simple. I see the Washington and Beijing really had a very extremely different interpretation of what's the coronavirus, geostrategic implications. In the eyes of our, Americans' strategic community, then you see the pandemic is some sort of, we say, unique chance to shift the balance for power probably in China's favor. So then, and even some politician also mentioned the pandemic is Third World War launched by Chinese without just firing any shots. So then I see there's some sort of strategic anxiety in Americans' political and strategic community. So there's no way US could allow the pandemic will reopen some sort of a window of opportunity for China to just shorten some sort of power disparity between the two countries. So such a anxiety also turning into some sort of, we say, greater military presence by the American Navy since the early March. Then they will see Americans' military presence and the warship and the naval warship and airplanes, the patrolling in South China Sea almost double from them last year's, the presence in terms of its scale and its, we say, frequency. So then such a things really just very alarmingly remind us, if both sides really just trying to move in some more assertive way to show their just insurmountable resolve to stick with their claim in South China Sea, then we will see South China Sea proved to be has never been more potentially dangerous in terms of some sort of such a escalating possibility of accidental, encountering and even clips, some sort of, we say, bumping at the sea and in air. Then we also know that back to 2001, the two military planes also just did a very tragic, mid-air collision. Then it caused the deaths of Chinese pilots and emergency landing of American surveillance plane. If this year some sort of such accidental encountering happened and caused the shade of blood, that will be some sort of, in my term, is load kill for some sort of very, very bad, deterioration of our relations. Then I think probably some sort of such a bloodshed will become the last straw to very tragically and disastrously just smashed our bilateral relations. Then third one, I have to say, yes, if the USSC pandemic is some sort of possibly a window of opportunity for China to just regain some sort of a favorable balance of power shift. But in the eyes of the Chinese, we're also less sensible to some sort of uniqueness of a pandemic season in the region. Then the Beijing also can't wait longer to just launch the Chinese Coast Guard ship to just safeguard China's claim in some sort of such a non-alarm friend area. Then, yeah, of course, causes some sort of, we say, complaints and even, we say, criticism from the neighboring countries. But from the Beijing's perspective, we also see there's no way we can condone Americans' assertive, military presence in the South China Sea. Then we will see even politically with the different and the very, very stemly, the contrasting, the interpretation on what the South China Sea mean in each, policy weighing. Then some sort of such a potential of a collision is also surging. Then my conclusion is this. Given some sort of disastrous deterioration of our relations, then we will see the mood on either side is also getting more volatile and probably is just very aggressive. So then I see a lot of complaints from the Chinese side. Then I also read a lot of complaints from the American side, particularly when Trump just completely repeated his term, China virus, and holding the China accountable. Then we will see also such some sort of going a little bit further, such a overturned, political mood probably will accelerate some sort of, we say, such a less vigilance in their behavior. Yes, both mutually have the two memos. Then such a two memo also set a line for the either side to keep the safe distance when they encounter both in air and at sea. But given some sort of such a significantly turning south mood, what worries me so much is this. Yeah. Then if the either side just feel less, completely restrained in their behavior, then any incidental encountering and a collision also will cause the bloodshed. Then given some sort of such an environment, it will be very, very disastrous for our relations. Okay. So last one, Steve, is this year there is a suspension of all level of the military contacts. Yeah. It also become a very, very timely reminder. So maybe the maritime management in South China Sea needed to bring back the mill contacts. Thank you.
Okay, great. Zhu Feng, thank you. Raised a lot of questions, which hopefully we'll get to in the Q&A. Let me turn it over to Peter.
Thanks very much, Steve. I'm going to offer a word of pessimism, a word of optimism, and a word of caution. So I'll start with a word of pessimism. Look, Assistant Secretary of State David Stilwell said China is engaged in a campaign to impose an order of might makes right in the South China Sea and to replace international law there. It's hard to disagree with that. This is the word of pessimism. We can talk about the details of international law and the way China's approach undermines the global stability of international law. And we can also talk about China's power-based coercive actions in the South China Sea, which in the end up holding hostage the interests of the other coastal states in the region. And frankly, becomes the driver of a lot of the dynamics in the South China Sea. The Chinese side has to realize that a lot of its behavior is part of the problem in the South China Sea. It's not just everyone else, it's also, and significantly, China's behavior in the South China Sea. The word of optimism has to do with some encouraging dynamics. Increasingly over the last decade or so, there's been a increasing move by other claimants in the South China Sea to use international law and to use international institutions to institutionalize their disputes, right? This is, I think, a very productive movement towards the 20th and 21st century, where we recognize that power-based outcomes are fundamentally destructive and destabilizing to the international regime. Since 2009, Vietnam and Malaysia have used the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf to make clear their approach to the South China Sea based on international law. The Philippine arbitration reinforced many of these same issues. And since 2019, Malaysia has re-energized its approach to the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf, resulting in this really important crescendo of international support for international law and use of institutions in the South China Sea to resolve those disputes. And so I come to the word of caution, and here I would actually like to address the very first question in the Q&A, because the word of caution has to do with undermining the globally stabilizing regime that the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea has brought us. You might legitimately fault the United States for failing to join the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, but at least you can't fault the United States for fully supporting its approach to international rights and freedoms in the maritime domain. Right? This is a really important point. And so the very first question, actually, in the Q&A queue has basically asked, well, isn't China's approach to the South China Sea really no different from the American Monroe Doctrine in the 1890s and early 1900s? And my response to that is, well, let's even assume it's true. I mean, it's a debatable point, but let's assume it's true. Haven't human affairs come a long way in the last century and a quarter? Haven't 2 world wars and a nuclear armed Cold War taught us that power-based outcomes are fundamentally destructive and destabilizing? And shouldn't we all be reinforcing international regimes that have brought clarity and stability to international rights and obligations in the maritime domain? I think it's important to recognize, for all states to recognize, that China has interests in the South China Sea, but so do the other coastal states, and law makes clear what they are. Additionally, other states have interest in the South China Sea. The United States, UK, France, Germany, and many others, Australia, India, et cetera, have all made clear that this is a zone in which the international community has very important interests as well. So my response to the very first questioner is, I would hope we can all agree that human history has come a very long way since the power dynamics of the 1890s and early 1900s that left us all in the shambles of the first half of the 20th century. And I'm hoping that the 21st century doesn't repeat that process.
Terrific, Peter. In fact, you laid a perfect foundation for my first question, which is based on Wu Shichen's kind of presentation. And what Taylor said, the Pompeo's speech with respect to the South China Sea and Assistant Secretary Stilwell's follow-up, and then subsequent policies really didn't change the foundation of US policy in the South China Sea. That there is, and the idea that in a Biden administration, we're going to see a change in that policy, I would not, if I were sitting in your chair, think that is the case. There is virtually universal recognition in the US think tank community, government, and academia that China is acting in violation of international law. And the pushback is going to continue whether we have a President Trump or whether we have a President Biden. The sanctions, the only thing, the sanctions, as Taylor pointed out, the sanctions that are being placed on SOEs that did the dredging in the South China Sea is a new policy. Increasing US military presence in the South China Sea is really just a marginal change. That fundamental policy is there. So my question for President Wu, and then for the Americans to comment on, are you suggesting we should have a new grand bargain, that kind of the two sides should sit down and just come up with a new way to think about the South China Sea? Is that what your points were aimed at suggesting?
I think so. Both China and the United States should sit down to discuss the South China Sea, both in the Chapter 1 level and even Chapter 2 level. But now, in this administration, I mean the Trump administration, I don't think it is the right time, because so far, our Chapter 1 dialogue mechanism now, all stopped, all cancelled. So I just mentioned U.S. South China policy from neutrality from my perspective, 1995, when mischief accident was happening. Before that time, U.S. holds this neutral stance of South China Sea, and from that time, U.S. adjusted its South China policy from neutrality to limited intervention since 2010, when Hillary Clinton attended the ASEAN foreign minister meetings, announced the U.S. policy, U.S. new position towards South China Sea. So that since that time, U.S. South China policy adjusted from limited intervention to active intervention. So Pompeo's statement is a sign that the United States is taking side to support whoever who would like to confront with China on the South China Sea issue. So I don't think it's possible right now to talk about the South China Sea issue between China and the United States, but it's necessary, even it's auditory, to talk about the South China Sea issue on how to avoid the potential conflict in the South China Sea, avoid the possibility of a fire-off of the military confrontation in the South China Sea.
Peter, did you want to add something on that?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Steve. So, I mean, I want to make it abundantly clear, the U.S. has never been neutral about the application of international law to maritime rights and interests in the South China Sea. And the United States has never been neutral about its approach to condemnation of power-based dynamics in the way that China and the other Southeast Asians resolve their disputes. And so that's the first thing. Second, I want to remind our panelists and listeners that it was under the Obama administration, the first Obama administration, that the entire policy of pushing back in the South China Sea became sort of heightened as a policy approach. So I don't think we're going to see any major change in U.S. policy, even if we have a change in administrations. The third quick point to make is that I do agree with Wu Shizun in the sense that going forward, after the politics settles down from whatever happens in this election, it will be time for a fresh conversation between the U.S. and China about managing the militarization of the South China Sea and managing the disputes in the South China Sea. But I think either side, Republican or Democrat, will approach it in roughly the same way.
I agree with that. Y.H. Sung asks a question. He's also a member of the Track 2 dialogue that we have on these issues. China declares making the South China Sea into a sea of peace, friendship, and cooperation. ASEAN proposes to make the South China Sea a sea of peace, stability, and prosperity. They both agree to maintain peace and stability in the South China Sea. What about the United States? Is it possible for the United States government to make a peace and cooperation proposal, which maybe gets to exactly what Peter was suggesting, that when things settle down after the election, we should move in that direction? Peter or Tabitha or Taylor, you want to answer that?
I'll let one of my colleagues know.
I can jump in. I mean, I think, going back to the initial statement of the Obama administration, I think, maintaining peace in the South China Sea was an important part of U.S. policy, right? And so one could make a another declaratory statement to that effect. They both sound good, what China says and what ASEAN says, but of course, the real question is how do you put that into practice, and what are the details, right? The trends seem to be moving in the opposite direction. I do think, for example, going back to some of the issues raised earlier, right? We do have mechanisms in place, at least from a U.S.-China conflict perspective, like the MMCA and the MOUs, that can be used as a basis for conversation, because these were primarily designed to prevent incidents that would then lead to potential miscalculation or escalation. And so certainly I think that the position of any US government would be that they would rather see peace and stability in the South China Sea than conflict and instability.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that too. I think, this is also related to the previous question that Steve asked about a new grand bargain, or at least resetting the conversation. I think all sides do want peace and cooperation. I think Biden will not change the policy on the South China Sea, or not change the problems, at least, that we're dealing with. But if he were to become president, I think it will inject some stability and normalcy in the relationship, which I think will help. But honestly, I think what we all need is more candor about what is going on. And like Peter said, recognizing that the other side has interests. We need to talk about those interests more explicitly. We need to talk about what's behind some of the activities. And so when I think about fishing activities, for example, there have been a lot of statements from all sides, including China, that there's a lot of potential here to come up with some kind of arrangement. But if you look at, for example, the huge subsidy program that China has to send fishing vessels down to the Spratly Islands to fish, it's not, there's no way that this is economically profitable for China, nor is the catch that China is bringing in even contributing any relevant percentage of China's protein needs. If there were political will to establish some kind of arrangement, it probably would have happened already. And so I think we just need to be more real about, what the presence really is. And, some of these fishing vessels, which are actually maritime militia, aren't even really fishing. And so I think we're not going to get to the heart of some of these problems unless we're able to talk about them in a very real way.
So I'll just quickly add, Steve, if I might, our mutual friend Jerry Cohen says, heaven's a wonderful place. The question is, how do you get there, right? And so the point about, the South China Sea as this wonderful nirvana is a great idea. The question is, how do you get there, right? And this is why I am actually in favor of Wu Shizhen's proposal to re-energize dialogues at all levels, track 1, track 2 dialogues, as a starting point, right? As a starting point to get there. And this is my hope that regardless of the outcome of the election, there'll be a fresh opportunity to relook at the possibility of initiating these dialogues.
I think there's Zhu Feng, go ahead, and then Wu Shizhen, and then let's go to the next question. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think the key, uncertainty is how serious Pentagon will be to conduct some sort of such a mil-mil relations with Beijing. I think Mr. Esper also mentioned in July, he would like to visit China until the end of this year. I think his remarks also, very positively echoed from China. Then I also see even PLA also would like to see Mr. Esper could keep his words. But the problem is so far there's no, the sign. The Pentagon would like to just getting back to the Beijing and just re-energize the mil-mil talk at some sort of a very important level. So I see the suspension for mil-mil relations is some sort of consequence of a political deterioration, or is some sort of Pentagon's new subordination to the Trump's, such a very mad and even aggressive, style? It's my question for Peter.
A quick response to Stephen's question on how to build South China Sea as a peace and cooperation. I think there are at least 3 preconditions to do so. Number 1 is to implement the maritime cooperation in contained in the DOC. For instance, environmental protection, marine scientific research, search and rescue, and safety of navigation. The second to reach consensus on the COC as soon as possible to build the rule-based order in South China Sea. Why the international community concerns the South China Sea issue? Because it lacks the security architecture. So the COC, once it is in place, will solve this problem. Number three, the outside countries, particularly United States, not try to force other member states to choose side between China and United States. Thank you. Three preconditions.
Peter, did you want to add anything?
I'm astonished to hear that we need to build a rule-based order in the South China Sea. We have a very workable rules-based order that has applied around the globe to good effect. All we need to do is apply it in the South China Sea, and many of these problems go away.
The Bonnie Glazer has an interesting question for, he's got a bunch of interesting questions, but this one, I'll kick off with this one for either Wu Shichen or Zhu Feng. Will China seek to prevent the Philippines from accepting bids from international energy companies to develop gas at Reed Bank? Is joint development with a Chinese company the only option available to the Philippine government?
Zhu Feng? Professor Zhu Feng?
Yeah, I think Bonnie raised a very good question. Then we'll also see the Manila just cancel any the restriction to the South China Sea based gas and oil exploration. Then it also will just how say probably show some sort of diplomatic progress between Beijing and Manila, because it's based on some sort of we say consensus, some sort of such a oil and gas exploration probably will through some sort of their consensus. But what does the consensus absolutely mean? It's just the how say the exploration between Chinese and the Filipinos companies. I don't think so. So any concrete project probably could involve the third party. I think it's out of a question. So then my answer is that, I think some sort of a consensus between Beijing and Manila will open the door for the participation of third parts, or your company or third part country.
Wu Shichen, did you want to add anything on that?
Yes. There was a successful case of bilateral cooperation, so-called joint development activities between China and the Philippines from the year 2005 to 2008. Actually, it was tripartite cooperation between China, the Philippines, and Vietnam. So far, the bilateral cooperation between the two oil companies of the Philippines and China now is going smoothly. I just find that just yesterday, the Philippine president canceled the restrictions on cooperation foreign within the Philippines. I think it was a good sign to promote such maritime cooperation between China and the Philippines. We call it joint development activities between our two oil companies. From my perspective, it's not an easy job to do so, because joint development is so complicated and sensitive. The important issue is to select the place, which area is both acceptable for Chinese side and the Philippine side. So not easy in the future.
Interesting.
I have something I'd love to add to that too. So I know that this sounds possibly naive or unrealistic, but I think it's something that we have to get on the table, and the idea must be floated. And that's the idea that we would leave the hydrocarbon in the seabed. I was in Seattle for a couple of weeks when I literally couldn't go outside because of our forest burning around us, and the whole world is dealing with a lot of climate change issues. And I do think we're at the point where we have alternative solutions. It might mean rethinking, some country stances on nuclear power, but I think there's a lot of potential there. Hydrogen, And I think it's something that we need to very seriously consider, despite all of the momentum going in the other direction to drill. But I think it's something that needs to be on the table.
Very interesting. Let's see, President Wu, from your institution, from Hung Nung and Matt Garachi, what role is the Quad, United States, Japan, Australia, and India, going to play in the region's strategic competition in the coming years? Let's either Wu Shichen or Zhu Feng first speak to that, and then Peter, Tabitha, or Taylor speak to that.
Yeah, I think the Quad is a big concern. But the problem is, particularly after some sort of deterioration of our bilateral relations, then we consider, for example, a couple of the top diplomats and even very important Pentagon officials also emphasize the necessity of formation of the Asian version of NATO. So if a Quad just how they become just another some sort of multilateral realignment movement in the region, then of course, from the Chinese perspective, we will be very, very scared to be completely cornered. So that's also China's concern over the Quad, just how they're surging. But on the other hand, we also consider it's not easy if China could behave much better. So Peter and Taylor and Teresa also mentioned some sort of Chinese need some sort of get over behavior, more welcome and more, rule-based, just oriented. So then I see the Quad maybe just as in some sort of dynamic moment. But the problem is my confidence is absolutely lying on some sort of China's growing regional economic and social influence. On the other hand, I also see that China will be learning how to act more smartly.
I have had some thoughts. My concern is this with regard to the Quad mechanism. Initially, Quad mechanism is applying to Indian Ocean, but I'm not quite sure whether the Quad mechanism will apply to the South China Sea. If the Quad cooperation mechanism is applied to the South China Sea, I think China would take a tit-for-tat action, such as so. In that case, that will not be conducive to the South China Sea peace and stability. So far, the United States, Japan, and Australia have their military activities in South China Sea, but India not yet send its warships into the South China Sea. So it's my concern. I'm some worrisome to that case.
Peter, Tabitha, Peter, if you want to do that one, or Taylor?
So I've lost a little bit of the thread, but I did see in some of the questions that there's a lot of questions about queues. And I do want to say a couple of things. First, my personal view is that queues should apply across the board, that if we can include Coast Guard ships, so much the better. And then secondly, I want to push back on something I think it was Zhu Feng said and Bonnie Glaser raised in the questions, which is what are the special circumstances under which China believes that queues would not apply to military vessels in the South China Sea? It's those, in my view, it's exactly those special circumstances when it must be applied in order to ensure that we maintain stability between our militaries.
The non-experts, please describe what queues are.
Sorry, the code, we keep talking about this. It's the code for unexpected or unanticipated.
Unplanned.
Thank you. Encounters at sea, right? So it's in other words, it's when one sovereign vessel, either Navy or Coast Guard vessel, encounters another, there's a certain sort of process you're supposed to operate or to engage each other with in order to operate successfully, even in times of tension and crisis. And so to suggest that there are times of tensions and crisis when it shouldn't apply is quite concerning. Zhu Feng, I think you suggested that, or am I wrong?
Yes, I did.
Well, then if you're asking for stability in the South China Sea, but saying China shouldn't follow the rules when there's conflict and crisis, isn't that escalatory?
No, I think we all know how complicated the South China Sea maritime claims and even sovereign, we say, assertion among some sort of very, very contending, claimants. So then I think the Chinese mostly feel very, very grieved because we're considered we're the first country to just made up some sort of such a sovereign claims in a non-Dutch line when we join it. Back to 1946, we also got the consent from the State Department of the United States. But now we think with the time change, I think some sort of a basic strategic, concern of our American friends, American governments to the East Asia also very, very dramatically changed. So then I have to say, yeah, I really love to see the China's growing resilience in handling the South China Sea. Rule-based order, of course, is also serving the China's interest fully. But on the other hand, we also see another indispensable part of a regional order is also power-based. It's not China only. Then we will see the US is mostly just working on that regard. So then I really hope some sort of re-energization of the talks, not just multilaterally, but also bilaterally, and also could just trade some sort of, we say, understanding and pragmatically gauge some sort of a new diplomat, the breakthrough could just come true. I think it will need a lot of passion and a lot of wisdom, but it's the only way we can get the South China Sea's conflict just ease down.
So to respond to that, if I might, Steve, in all seriousness, when those outside of China hear that China claims based on ancient history, the South China Sea, we think about, should that mean Rome claims all of the Mediterranean? No, history moves forward, and history and all of human history moves forward along with the entire 20th century, where together, along with the People's Republic of China, we created the institution of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. The People's Republic of China helped to create that. All we're asking is that the People's Republic of China apply it in the South China Sea. And it's deeply concerning to me to hear that you think that the cues should not be applied in certain times of crisis. That's significantly destabilizing in my view.
Cues is absolutely necessary and insurmountable. But the problem is, given some sort of such a, we say, more complicated situation and even just the scenario-based, some sort of potential risk, the cues is not enough at all. So we need at least just resume the all level of the mil contacts. We need to get the two militaries to build their acquaintance. It's a very workable way to lower the hostility and the miscalculation. So Peter, from this point, I think the QC is important, but on the way, we should re-energize some sort of all level of military talks. Even just 4 years ago, so Nanjing is China's Eastern Military Zone's headquarters. So I did a lot of interview there. They see, we have a very good military contacts with our American counterparts. So some sort of such a contact is not just to get them, dismissal, miscalculation. Most important thing is acquaintance building.
The kind of a follow-up question to that from another participant in our Track 2 dialogue, Admiral Mike McDivitt. He asks, arguably, U.S.-China tension over the South China Sea would disappear almost overnight if China dropped its claim to historic rights in the associated 9-dash line. Do you think that's true?
No, I totally disagree. Please.
I don't think so. 9-dash line is all China's claims based on the 9-dash line. Historical rights is important for China claim, over the maritime interests in South China Sea region. So I don't think it's impossible for China to abandon 9-dash line, both 9-dash line.
Asking if it could be abandoned. that the historical rights, wouldn't tension dissipate? Because that's the basis of a lot of the conflict.
For China, China should make clear what the historical rights means. It is important, but it's impossible for China to abandon its historical rights claim. I think what China should do is make clear what does historical rights means for China, for China's claim over the South China Sea, both in maritime features and the maritime jurisdiction claims.
I believe the Convention of the Law of the Sea specifies what historical rights what claims you could make. Is that right, Peter or Taylor or Tabitha?
Yeah, it's pretty clear. The Chinese have tried to find a way to thread the needle outside of the convention, but in fact, that this is not an approach to international law that is accepted by either the arbitration panel or by others. Frankly. So China's claims to historic rights in the South China Sea have no basis in international law, and if they do clarify them, as Wu Shutsun suggests, at least we'll have a much better idea. Maybe there's some, approach that could be accepted in international law. But so far, the broad claims that they've made just simply do not have a basis in international law. And I tend to agree with Admiral McDivitt that a lot of the problems would go away if China conformed its approach to the South China Sea to the convention.
Some of the problems, not all of them, but also a significant proportion of the problems would go away if everyone were to decide to leave the hydrocarbon in the seabed. It's kind of what started everything off in the 70s to begin with, all the fighting.
I would say one point here. I've sort of described the South China Sea disputes as sort of being supercharged because you have territorial and maritime claims, plus you have shifting power dynamics. And so if the 9-dash line were to go away, that would remove a lot of the problems, but I think you'd still have kind of the foundational shifting power dynamics that would certainly play out in the naval domain between the US and China in the South China Sea, and that would certainly stay. So it would be an improvement, but I don't think it would be a total and complete amelioration of the potential for tensions in the South China Sea between China and the United States.
So my view on that, Tabitha, is that I agree with Taylor. And the reason I do is that I think that the Chinese, fundamentally, the hydrocarbons in the South China Sea don't really make an economic difference, especially to China's economy. They do to some of the Southeast Asian economies, but mostly they don't to China's economy. My view is that the Chinese uses the disputes for purposes of status, right? To impose rule sets, to impose, to achieve status in relationship to Southeast Asians. And that's really the fundamental dynamic that isn't going to change.
Yeah, and I agree with all of that. You're not going to solve all the problems, but just in terms of thinking of new approaches.
Good idea.
With regard to historical rights, if we look at some international practices, historical rights is still with there. If we look at the case between Yemen and Anatolia, arbitration case, the tribunal accepted and recognized the historical rights between Yemen and the Anatolia case. I don't think that there was no basis in the international law of the historical rights.
I've studied that case in great detail. That's a case in which both parties asked the tribunal to make a special accommodation for them. So that's a special accommodation, not a rule of international law. So second, you said earlier, Wu Shutsun, that China could never abandon its historic rights in the South China Sea. I find that's just not accurate. I mean, of course China can. Taylor Fravel, our colleague here, maybe you want to talk to this, Taylor. He's written extensively on how China has resolved disputes over territory with other countries that where China was generous in its relinquishing claims to space. China has made many circumstances in the past where, because it achieved a benefit for doing so, it relinquished claims. I just want to make that point.
I don't think it's going to be easy to get China to walk back on a very clearly stated policy that it's upheld for a long time. I mean, I think we just have to reframe the issue in a different way, essentially. It's one possibility, I think.
Yeah, so then I think the latest case is we also know there is some sort of maritime disputes between the Turkish and Greece on the Eastern Mediterranean, oil and gas exploration. I think if you read the Turkish's claim, then it's also very, very obviously contain some sort of such a history-based their preoccupation in the East Mediterranean area. They suffer a lot of protesting from Greece. So then my view is this, or some sort of such South China Sea disputes couldn't just absolutely just referring to, for example, UNCLOS. UNCLOS just very important legal instrument, but we also have other, the international legal instrument. Maybe we can also get them just how to match up. Then it's also the bigger impression I got from Chinese lawyer and the legalist, the community. So they always say now the U.S. just trying to overblow the Chinese South China Sea claim, just very narrowly based on UNCLOS. But the problem is UNCLOS is not all of international legal system. So Peter, do you agree with that?
Zhu Feng, this is not a U.S.-China issue, right? This is China versus Malaysia, Vietnam, Philippines, Brunei, Indonesia, United States, United Kingdom, Germany, France. Every one of these countries, right, has made clear how the rules of UNCLOS apply in the South China Sea. It's only China that is increasingly isolated in its approach to its claims in the South China Sea. We're not talking about sovereignty over islands. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about boundaries in the water space. So China's increasingly isolated in that regard.
Yes, I agree. So I see the China's situation of the South China Sea is really deteriorating. So we need to show the flexibility. But the problem is just the ways we got to the Americans, reinforce the military presence in South China Sea to be Chinese intellectual. I found it's getting harder for Chinese community to enforce some sort of such a supposedly, let's say, flexibility. I'm very honest.
Yep.
Then I have a question to my American colleagues about the cues apply to Coast Guards. Is it possible to reach consensus between our two Coast Guards to apply the cues to Coast Guards? What is the cue issue? Because as I know, Chinese, Coast Guard is reluctant to reach consensus with the U.S. counterpart on this issue. The cues.
The base of cues, right, is coal regs, and which are earlier regulations. And so I think in principle, there's no reason why you couldn't have a Coast Guard agreement that would apply the cues principles, which themselves derive from other principles for maintaining sort of safety at sea. So I think it would be a political question much more than a kind of a technical question.
Yeah. By the way, speaking of some of the law of the sea issues that are contentious between the United States and China, Mr. Bosco asked, do the Chinese participants believe that international support is growing for restrictions on military actions? By that, I think he means naval ships going through by other states in the EEZ. So the majority of states support the US position that military vessels can go in. There are a few states that side with China's position. Do you, Zhu Feng and Wu Shuchen, think that China's getting additional support for its position?
Basically, no, I don't see that way. Then we will see just since the outbreak of the pandemic, the South China situation is increasingly unfavorable to China. So I have to just admit to this reality. So that's why I really hope that the Beijing could show some sort of a growing flexibility and even creativeness, not just stabilizing the South China Sea issue, also could just get some sort of such a increasingly disputable, claims and become less disruptive and less disturbing to the China's regional diplomacy and the regional image. But on the other hand, I also see there's a very big part of such a growing contradiction. And then see, for example, so US also just how say initiate the Indo-Pacific strategy, and so far China just takes such a strategy as some sort of fully China targeting and China containing. So then even now in the Chinese official vocabulary, there's no some sort of such a acceptance of the words of Indo-Pacific. We still use Asia-Pacific. So some sort of such an exclusion of the Indo-Pacific from Chinese official vocabulary, then we will see it's some sort of a Chinese growing alarming, we say, the vigilance. So then, yes, practically we will see there's some sort of such a optimal way to narrow down the gap among the different sides. But what's just got me very saddened, is I see some sort of a real gap is still widening.
How would China respond if Vietnam seeks arbitration through UNCLOS to determine resource rights in Vanguard Bank? That question is from our Track 2 dialogue participant, Isaac Barton.
Yeah. 志春兄，您来回答这个问题。
I don't think Vietnam right now would do so to file another arbitration case to either ITLOS or ICJ because China and Vietnam, we have consensus to solve the relevant disputes of such an issue through a bilateral approach. So if Vietnam would do so, it violates the consensus reached by our two countries. If it is the case, Vietnam insists to do so, I think the Chinese position will have no change compared with the Philippine arbitration case. No participation, no acceptance.
We're running low on time. So, and I think there's some interesting consensus that have emerged from this discussion. One is we need more track 1s and track 2s on South China Sea issues. We need a rethink of policies. Both governments need to kind of think about it. There's certainly a consensus on the American side that no matter who was president on January 21st, 2021, the US policy on the South China Sea is not going to go and not going to have a wholesale shift. So my question is actually related to now through January 20th, a period where I think, President Wu, Zhu Feng, and others have kind of stated we're really nervous. What's one thing that we should do to avoid a kinetic incident between now and January 20th? And whichever order, just put up your hand if you want to take a stab at that one. Wu Shichen, your hand was up first.
Yeah. It is important both China and United States, particularly United States, should exercise restraint to, take provocative actions in the South China Sea region from now on till next January, because this time is the key time for us to maintain peace and stability in South China Sea. So it's important to exercise restraint, not to take the provocative actions targeting at another side. I just mentioned in my presentation what United States should do, what China should do. Keep restraint. Try our best to avoid, fight off potential possibility.
I think, Steve, thanks. I think, first of all, I need to say everything I've said today are my own personal views, not meant to represent the US government's views. But the number one thing that we need to do is to follow the rules at all times. follow the rules, the code for unplanned encounters at sea, the call regs, et cetera, follow them at all times. That's how you maintain stability, even in times of crisis and tension. So if this is a particularly volatile time, it becomes especially important, Zhu Feng, that we all follow the rules at all times.
Yes, so quickly just to add, I think there's broadly shared conspiracy theory, so-called conspiracy theory in China. Before the power transition by the next January 20, probably Trump, if he loses the election, if he want to just how say tie up some sort of his lower polling, he may just trying to just hijack China as some sort of leading factor. He can just force the entire Americans to reunify. That means he probably will risk just creating some sort of a military context, military conflicts with the Chinese and turning China factor into China crisis. Such a conspiracy theory will come true. So it's our bigger concern.
Phil or Tabitha, anything you want to add?
I just want to echo what Peter said and also add that at least one thing in the favor of stability also is the weather, which deteriorates in the South China Sea this time of year and hopefully keeps ships even farther apart from each other than they would otherwise normally be. But again, the best way to maintain stability is to follow the rules that both sides have agreed upon. Restraint, which Dr. Wu mentions, also is mutual, right? So it's not simply that one side or the other side should be restrained, but if both sides are worried about maintaining stability, then that should be shared to include actions China might potentially take in the EEZs of other countries during this period. And then finally, on conspiracy theories, I mean, like I love reading a great novel. It's hard to know what to make of any of these, but one has to ask, what would the real benefit be in the end for the president of the United States? And usually these conspiracy theories just end with no benefit. I don't think I would put much stock in those stories, Zhu Feng.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I would add that I agree with the other commenters that following the rules is important. I've also heard from other Chinese counterparts that they're aware that this is a really tense time for the United States. And so I think that awareness is good. And then otherwise, I think, just laying the groundwork for, expanding dialogues, figuring out ways, possibly at all levels in which we can find areas for cooperation and try to make some progress.
I want to thank the panelists. Not only were you great panelists today, you're great participants in our Track 2 dialogue. I want to thank Wu Shichen and Zhu Feng for staying up so late to be with us and to educate our audience. And I want to thank you for the partnership that you have with the National Committee, that no matter what goes on the government to government levels, we are strong believers in having these discussions on a Track 2 level. And it is critical that at a time when there's great tension in the government to government level, that we continue to have these dialogues, and we value that partnership and will continue it. But thank you all. I've kept two of you up probably way past your bedtime, but thank you all, and thank you for participating in our Track 2s. And I thank the audience who all have stayed throughout for joining us today. Thanks all.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Peter.